Welcome back to the Nutrimedical Report, and we have Harley Schlanger on, of course, every Wednesday. It's either Harley or one of the other amazing team members of the LaRouche Foundation, and you've got some great news and some shocking news of what's going on in the world regarding Venezuela first, and about the Abominator. Let's get the good, bad, and the ugly news as to what's happening.
Well, let's start with something that is not being reported by hardly anyone, and certainly not on Fox News, which is that there's a Supreme Court ruling last week that basically said national sovereignty doesn't exist. Now, this was in reference to a case brought by a hedge fund against the nation of Argentina. Argentina basically was screwed by the IMF between 2000 and 2003, stuck with a debt similar to what was done to Greece, and Argentina couldn't pay it. So over a period of 4 years, they did a renegotiation with all of their creditors, and in the meantime, they were placed in default. So they were paying on this, and they were promising to pay, but as the value of the Argentine bonds dropped, speculators moved in and bought them for a nickel on the dollar. Now, when it turned out Argentina would pay a majority of it back, there's going to be somewhat of a haircut, but I think mostly they're going to pay it back. One of the hedge funds refused to accept the negotiations. So you had the creditors holding 94.5% of the debt agreeing to the reorganization. And two hedge funds said no, they wouldn't agree. And they went to court demanding a right to seize Argentine national property to pay the debt. Now, these two hedge funds paid a total of, I think, a couple $1 million for their share because they bought distressed bonds, and they're insisting on a full payment, which would be something like $168 million, or actually it's $900 million that they were demanding. And a New York City judge ruled in favor of the hedge fund.
Wow.
So throwing out the agreement that was made by 94.5% of the creditors. So Argentina appealed it. It went to the Supreme Court. And what Argentina argued is that the agreement was good. They were ready to pay. All the creditors except these two creditors went along with it. But that if they had to pay at full value to those two creditors, it would destroy the agreement that was worked out, and Argentina couldn't pay it, and then they would default completely.
Wow.
And so the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the two hedge funds, that they have a right to Argentine national assets, even though they were not the original debt holders. They were just speculators who bought the bonds at almost nothing. Now, the president of Argentina took out an ad in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Wall Street Journal describing the sequence, that they were prepared to pay, but they couldn't pay the whole thing. 94.5% of the funds agreed to do this, and these two hedge funds wouldn't. And they said, we don't care what the U.S. Supreme Court says. We're not going to give up a pound of flesh in Argentina to fulfill the speculators.
How would the U.S. Supreme Court have jurisdiction in Argentina anyway?
Well, isn't that an interesting point? But what they're saying is that if this company wants to get a sheriff and seize an Argentine national ship or seize the consulate in Washington, D.C., they would be allowed to do it. That's what the Supreme Court ruling says. So there's no longer sovereignty for a nation under this. Now, immediately, the G77, which is actually 130-something nations, heard the case and voted unanimously to support Argentina. The Organization of American States had a meeting in Washington on Tuesday, and the only member of the OAS that opposed Argentina was the United States. All the rest of Latin America supported Argentina. Now, at the end of, or in the middle of this month, on the 15th of July, there's a BRICS meeting, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. We'll be meeting in Brazil to set up a new development fund to expand their overall cooperation. And they've invited Argentina to that meeting. And before that meeting, Putin will visit Argentina, and after that meeting, President Xi of China will visit Argentina. Now, just to summarize, what you have is the U.S. Supreme Court saying that it's legitimate to seize assets of a nation based on a U.S. court ruling on behalf of speculators. And the rest of the world is saying no, including France and Great Britain, 100 members of parliament. And, the British don't really like the Argentines because of the fight over the Malvinas.
Right.
Or the so-called Falklands. But 100 members of parliament in Britain signed an amicus brief in support of Argentina against the U.S. courts and basically against the International Monetary Fund. So here you couldn't have a more perfect example of the collapsing transatlantic system, represented largely now by the Obama administration and the neocons in the United States, who say there's no national sovereignty, no nation can protect its people or its own sovereignty against the power of international speculators, versus the rest of the world that's saying, go to hell, we're not going to support you. And I think that's why, when you see that, you see why there's so much desperation in Obama and some others to have these wars. Because they're afraid that this global rebellion will end up sinking our financial system. Because if the debtors say they're not going to pay, we're finished.
Well, firstly, they can't pay. The amount of debt that's held by the derivatives is equivalent to 500 and almost 600 Earths. The leverage
it's bigger. Dr. Deagle, the latest report from the Bank for International Settlements said that derivative obligations are growing at a 19% annual rate.
Well, I'm quoting last year, so I'm out of date by a year. But what I'm saying is that it is physically and mathematically impossible for nations to pay the debt.
Exactly.
And that means that system has to collapse. That's why we have negative interest in Europe for bank-to-bank intergovernment banks, if you want deposits. And that's why the period of what I call asset building and amalgamation by buying cheap money for the already wealthy is over. That game in town is finished. That table is folded. And what Putin is doing and the BRICS nations are they know that the attempt to start war in the Middle East and in Ukraine is all an attempt by the bankers to distract from the real issue, because the most powerful engine for the banks taking over, getting more assets, is war. And
it's not only to distract, it's actually to destroy the countries that are leading the fight against the bankers.
Right. And so the situation basically is dire, which means if the banks have their way, we're going to have World War III, and most of the population of Earth will die. If the banks don't have their way, we'll have independent nations who will build their own strong banking system within their own walls. We'll have an exchange system probably similar to Bretton Woods, which I think Lyndon LaRouche has been calling for. We'll have a system set up where derivatives are illegal. It's a criminal activity. And they want to even exempt it from the trans-European agreement between Europe and America, so that these kind of statements by Supreme Court justices, which have no jurisdiction. I mean, I don't understand why the judge make statements like this when, in fact, they have no right to make statements over international finance. It's insane.
Well, and in this case, the United States is standing alone in the world supporting speculators over people. Right. And I think that characterizes, but what you're saying is absolutely true. This is an outrageous decision that was made by the U.S. Supreme Court, and they'll never repay the debt. And, in fact, trying to enforce payment of the debt is already killing people. But the war danger is also real. Poroshenko was in discussions, the Ukraine so-called president, with Putin, Merkel, and Hollande. He agreed to extend the ceasefire, and then under pressure from the U.S., he withdrew that agreement.
Wow. So even a maniac like Poroshenko, who knows that he's going to push it to the Russians who go crazy, even he's being pushed by America beyond even his own crazy. Welcome back, and we've got lots of crazy things going on. Obama, of course, is completely out of control, and that's the other part of the story, is that there's a rising tide of within the Democratic Party. And I just want to read off a report here from CBS Los Angeles. Murrieta, which is a town about maybe half an hour from here, where I live in Vista, California, further in toward the desert. Officials, a very fancy town on its way, between Riverside and Los Angeles and where we are in North County. Officials warn immigration protests likely every time buses arrive. what's going on is the people in the town, a dramatic scene in Marietta that saw American flag-waving protesters prevent Homeland Security buses carrying undocumented migrant children and families from reaching a suburban processing center is likely to be repeated in coming days, a city official. Mayor Pro Tem Harry Ramos told KNX 1070's Dick Helton that the standoff Tuesday, which included several protesters holding U.S. flags and signs reading, "Stop illegal immigration" and "Illegals out," may occur every 72 hours as a new busload of immigrants are processed through Border Patrol. Now, a lot of the people here in Southern California are Hispanic, so it's not a matter of race at all. They're literally dumping people into the country that are many times carrying diseases or not properly being screened. And rather than helping people in those countries, Obama has sent every message, including the insane Nancy Pelosi that says we're all Americans when she literally went down there to Central America, kind of literally flaming this kind of immigration surge, which puts these people in grave danger coming up on these death trains, on the roof of trains, literally with little children. I think it's an obscene situation that Obama is pushing because he didn't get his immigration bill through. And he wanted to flood the country with not only people from Mexico and Central and South America, but from Middle Eastern countries. He even had a policy statement that he was going to take Muslims, especially those that had sexual preference problems such as bisexuality or gay, even preference even over highly qualified Muslims, say doctors and scientists, that were straight. So that's the craziness of what's going on with Obama. And I think that's only just one of the extreme things, as Hillary Clinton has said in the dinner last year, that Obama is an incompetent flake. That's her statement. And Bill Clinton made the statement at the same dinner that he hates Obama more than any other person he's ever met on earth in his entire life. And that's by a former president. And Bill Clinton, whether you like him or not, and he's done some pretty bad things like putting in the Glass-Steagall and allowing industrial espionage by Chinese, etc. But when someone makes a statement like that on a personal level, that's pretty serious. And when Clinton, who's very smart but very evil, makes a statement that Obama doesn't even have his hand on the till, tilling, to make sure the ship of state is moving forward, it gives you an idea just how incompetent and how out of touch with reality Obama really is. Your comments, Harley, because I think this is a good example of how there's going to be major pushback even inside the Democratic Party against the Abominator.
Well, I think, look, the most important thing for people to realize is that as you and I have been reviewing these developments week by week by week, what we're seeing is it's increasingly impossible to avoid the conclusion that Obama is at the heart of the problem. Now, right. Obama's not the cause of the problem. Obama is a puppet who is put in place to implement these policies.
Right.
But if you don't get rid of him, you'll never get at the people behind him. And
right.
what
It's the people. Yeah. In other words, the puppet is still the same one pushing the buttons of state and putting in policies that are causing us to be in economic chaos, like blocking the XL pipeline, allowing dangerous hydrochemical fracking that are destroying the aquifers, foreign military and economic policies that will destroy sovereignty of American Congress and Senate to make them vestigial. It just goes on and on. There's no area, either internal politics or external political interactions with any other country on earth that Obama doesn't blow. It's just mind-boggling how incompetent he is.
Well, and that's because of the other thing that you and I have been discussing, which is the driver behind this is the impending blowout of the transatlantic financial system.
Exactly.
What you were talking about before with derivatives, what I was reporting is the latest BIS, Bank for International Settlements report, shows that we're approaching the $2 quadrillion level.
Wow.
In nominal derivatives. Now, nominal derivative value doesn't mean that it's all backed up by something. It means that it's being traded, that banks are holding on to instruments with valuations that they know are never going to be reached, but they use those to get leverage to borrow more so they can create new derivative instruments. It's just a Ponzi scheme.
Right. And now, then, of course, the second article you have here deals with Argentina and bankruptcy. People don't realize the bail-in, which happened in a little over a year ago now, is a policy that the Canadian government has put in place, the U.S. government's put in place, the European, which means bail-ins. They're talking about in Europe 15% of everyone's assets. That means your jewelry, your deposits of gold and silver coins, your pension funds, your bank accounts, even the equity in your home. They're going to take a one-time, we call it, haircut, where they're going to take literally everybody's assets that has anything and bail it into the banks to keep them solvent.
And they're going to say it's good for you because that way we don't have to have the government go into debt to do a bailout. Now, what's important, just to get back to the point we were discussing at the beginning of the segment, we see all sorts of impeachable offenses being committed by Obama virtually every day.
Right.
What you have to get at is what's the cause for them? Why is there such a lawless policy being imposed from the outside? And that's because of this banking collapse, the bankruptcy. The fact that the system, I talked to economists like William White, the former chief economist for the Bank of International Settlements, key people from the Austrian Central Bank, from France. They're all saying that they think the thing's going to blow, and they ask what's happening in the United States. Is the U.S. really solvent? And after the revision of the first quarter GDP, which showed that the U.S. the economy shrank at a 2.9% annual rate in the first quarter, that got almost no attention in the U.S. press because everyone's focused on the bubble. And as long as a bubble goes up, people who have investments are happy. And so that's all you hear about. But as that bubble is set to pop, it's going to implode the whole system. It's going to trigger things that will include bailouts, bail-ins, hyperinflation, deflation, side by side. The money will be worth nothing, but no one will be able to buy anything because they won't have any money.
Right.
So we're looking at an extermination type event financially, which is why the bankers who control governments are pushing them for war. Same reason they did it before World War I, same reason they did it to put Hitler in power in World War II for these kinds of wars. Now that's why the most important thing is getting Obama out, because he's the puppet in charge.
Right. Once we remove him, he's like a logjam. We can start removing all the other influences in Congress and Senate. We can start moving powers of both the Republican Democratic Party to move for America and Americans first and people first. And we can start instituting policies that are on the list for the LaRouche Foundation for years to rebuild America. Back and Harley, we really, the time is getting very short. I kind of have a gut feeling. A lot of people should say trust their gut. I tell people to do three things. Number one, study things, like it says in the Bible, study to be approved. Look at all the data, and then try to get a kind of what I call a microscopic picture and a macroscopic picture, which is what LaRouche Foundation does. And we always have solutions, but there's also requires a time window so the solutions can happen. What I'm concerned about is the time window is narrowing so that if we're going to do something like remove Obama and get Glass-Steagall back and get control of our economic future, we don't have a lot of time left, because at some point it's going to get so out of control crazy that we're going to go through a level of destruction whether we like it or not. And unfortunately, that's converging. For example, we know that the economic chaos is what caused the Black Death of the Middle Ages. It wasn't the other way around. So plagues and economic devastation go together. Wars go together with economic manipulation because the bankers are always involved with starting wars. And I think that if we don't realize...
Well, also, just on that, the other thing is that the way the bankers function as an international force is a consolidation of power, including financial power, raw materials, food, and so on, so that it's in the hands of a small group of people. And under conditions of extreme stress between nations, it would be very easy for groups like Monsanto and Dreyfus Grain Company and others to trigger food shortages, which would then... as nutritional levels drop, as population becomes essentially a petri dish, a breeding ground for new disease. We already see that with some of the things going on in Africa, where you don't have water anymore, you don't have doctors, hospitals, power, electricity, and new diseases are spreading.
Exactly. In fact, those new diseases are and sometimes old diseases come back, but there are also new variants that are multi-drug resistant. Many of these children that are coming up have got swine flu, resistant tuberculosis, MRSA, Chagas, spirochetosis, all kinds of nastiness, because they're not properly being screened. They should be quarantined for a period of time to make sure they're well, but the fact is they should be deported back to their home country. We need to help support them to produce food and to clean up the gangs so the place becomes safer. We can work with their local country. That could have been done a long time ago. The problem is America launders illegal drug money. It's legal in America for banks to launder illegal drug money. Yeah, I was going to say the real
gang problem, people think that, well, gangs on the streets of Honduras who are shooting and killing people and torturing people, that's the real gang problem. The real gang problem is that the criminal cartels control the U.S. government.
Exactly. In fact,
and they're the ones who are destroying what's left of these economies of Central America.
Right. So, for example, the degradation in El Salvador, Nicaragua, Mexico, and elsewhere is all due to the fact that the bankers launder the money of these ultra-wealthy gang lords, and like the fourth richest man in the world in Mexico. It's legal for them to launder their money and have their money in U.S. and European and other banks. If that was illegal, and if they couldn't launder that money, and it was properly traced, those gangs would cease to exist. You'd literally cut off the carotid arteries.
It is illegal. It is illegal. But when Hong Kong Shanghai Bank got caught, they were given a $1 billion fine.
Well, illegal in the sense that they get paid what I call operating business expense fees, so that they can still do it, but they just pay their penalty and they continue operations.
You know, what should have happened with Hong Kong Shanghai Bank, which is a drug bank that has a record, an unbroken record of laundering drug money going back to the Second Opium War of the British against China in 1861. Bank of Hong Kong Shanghai was founded in 1862. They tried to take over a U.S. bank in 1981 called Marine Midland. You remember Marine Midland, one of the big six New York banks?
Yeah.
Bank of Hong Kong and Shanghai tried to take it over. And at the time, the banking commissioner in New York State was a woman named Muriel Siebert. And we went to her with the documentation of Hong Kong Shanghai's 120-year record at that time of laundering drug money. And she denied a state charter so that Hong Shang could not take over Marine Midland. So they went to the Federal Reserve. And by the time Greenspan came in, Greenspan granted them the exemption so they could take over Marine Midland. So in Greenspan's mentality, drug money laundering is part of free trade. Now, Dr. Deagle, I don't know if I sent you this link, but a couple weeks ago, the Eurostat, which is the European Union statistical agency, voted in a reform which says that starting in September of this year, European nations can count gambling, drugs, and prostitution as part of their gross product. Ironically, gambling, drugs, and prostitution, that's GDP, the initials for the three of them. And already, countries like Spain and Italy, where many people have been impoverished and they either gamble, they do drugs, or they become prostitutes, their GDP is going to go up 2 to 4%. Now, I used to teach classes on economics where I used to ask the question, which is more valuable? $10,000 invested in a steel mill that may take 3 to 5 years to make a profit, or $10,000 invested to build a whorehouse? And, you know, a lot of people in the short term say, well, you can make more money from the brothel, which is true, but what are the implications? Forget the so-called religious morality. What does it do to a nation when you encourage investment in gambling, drugs, and prostitution, and discourage investment in knowledge-intensive industries that are necessary to provide the living standards of the populations? Exactly. And that's the higher level of morality, which has been abandoned by economics and by the whole free trade deregulation regime that triumphed with the end of the Bretton Woods system in 1971, between 1971 and 1999, when Bill Clinton repealed, actually the Congress and Clinton signed the repeal of Glass-Steagall. In that 28-year period, we saw a wholesale destruction of regulatory policy in the U.S., which turned our country into a giant casino.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's where morality went. That's why when you see young people today who do things which shock you if you're in your 40s or 50s, even people who went through the boomer generation, the rock, sex, drug counterculture, we're shocked by what goes on with our children and grandchildren. But that's because of what we accepted in terms of the changes of policy, public policy, the rejection of the Constitution, the do-your-own-thing mentality, which was used by Wall Street to say, let the banks regulate themselves.
Yeah, that's very crazy. And, of course, that also means that the nation-states themselves will become vestigial, that their governments, Congress and Senate, their ability to make laws that actually that control their borders and their populations. We see that with Obama. What he's trying to do is wreck the idea of law, a law-abiding society, and the Supreme Court is just a rubber stamp for policies he's already placed. And,
well, he's actually breaking down the checks and balances system, which
right.
is the central feature of our founding fathers' decision on how to limit the power of an executive. They didn't want an emperor or a monarch, so they invested certain powers in the Congress and certain powers in the judiciary.
Right.
And the executive has certain strong powers, but also limits on those powers. Congress is giving up its authority under the Constitution, although we're seeing a fight back on that. There are 50 congressmen now that have signed a letter to Obama saying you must not do anything in Iraq without going to the Congress. Senator Tim Kaine, who was Obama's choice to head the DNC a few years ago, came out, he's a Democrat, and he said Obama cannot go to Iraq into war in Iraq without going to the Congress.
Yeah, well, then right now he's increasing the number of people he's saying to the green zone, another 200, so he's well on his way to violating that.
The Sunni population in Syria.
Right. Arlen, I want you to kind of repeat what you just told me in the break, because I think it's important people grasp how tenuous things are. And you mentioned one of the major sticking points is going to be the fall of the Assad government. We had Keith Davies on last week, and he was part of the group with Shubat Walid and Theodore Shubat. And they were talking about a behind-the-scenes agreement between Turkey and Iran to kind of step back and let Syria fall. Well, I don't think so. January of 2013, because I study the news methodically, there was a business deal where a pipeline was set up between Iran and Turkey because they have very little energy, so they have hydroelectric. Most of eastern Turkey is 85 to 95%, depending on where, it's around 95 mostly, are Kurdish. And it was in the past very Egyptly poor. The thing is, Kurdistan now is the richest oil area in the Middle East. More oil there than anywhere else in the entire Middle East in Kurdistan, which is northern Iraq. And that area is undisputed because they have the money for military force now, which is why they took Kirkuk. What I see is that Assad's not going to fall. You're going to see the alliance between probably Syria, Assad, Mr. Maliki of Iraq, and Iran against the Sunni forces that are trying to disrupt things from Qatar and Saudi Arabia, funded and supported by America and NATO. And America and NATO are going to get smacked hard because when you bring the Russians in, and they're not going to lose their naval base at Tarshish. The Russians have only one naval base in Syria, in the Middle East, in Syria. They have a long-standing relationship. They have tons of weapons there and support for Mr. Assad. And Assad and his group are just slaughtering these idiots that come in from Qatar and other places trying to tear down the regime. What's happening is they're gradually taking back towns, and what I see happening is Assad is not going to fall. And even if they took Assad, all his extended family and all of the relatives there, the same power brokers are going to be in place even if Assad left and went back to be an eye doctor in England, which is what he was. So this
Dr. Deal, I think one of the things we have to do, which is something that Obama doesn't do and which the U.S. media doesn't do, is distinguish between the broader community of Sunni Muslims as opposed to those who have been recruited by the Wahhabite and jihadist factions funded by Saudi Arabia and Qatar. That is that the majority of Sunnis are not jihadists, but it's a small grouping within the Sunni world. And they see their first enemy is the Shia Muslim, and secondly, the West. Now, these jihadists were created and funded and armed and trained with Saudi funding, but British and American advisors in Afghanistan in the 1980s to fight against the Russians. Since that time, that al-Qaeda network has grown, and when they supposedly were used on 9/11, which was a Saudi inside operation with the Bush and Cheney networks. What happened after that point was that the Saudis continued to recruit and advance the cause of jihad among the small radical fraction of Wahhabite types and Sufi types within the Sunni community. Now, Assad had an alliance with sections of the Sunni population in Syria because Syria was a secular republic. It wasn't a religious country. I mean, it had lots of religions and a lot of religious people, but it was a republic. Iraq, despite the problems of Saddam, and Saddam was tough at certain points on the Shia in Iraq rather. But Saddam held the country together by spreading the oil wealth to most of the population. And in Syria and in Iraq, you had a better average standard of living, better education, better access to health care, to professions, and so on, even if you were a Shia or a Sunni in Syria. Now, once you break down this idea of the nation state, and force people to fight on a tribal basis, that's where the barbarism is unleashed. No longer is there a sense of a nation. There's a sense of my clan, my family, my tribe. And that's what's called the Bernard Lewis plan. This is the modern version of a British imperial plan to carve up the Middle East into warring tribes, which will function under the broad umbrella of empire, but will do nothing for their populations. And that's what we see in countries like Saudi Arabia, where women still aren't allowed to drive. Women can't serve in the parliament. Women have no rights in Saudi Arabia. Here you have a president who claims to be empowering women all over the world. And our firmest allies are the Saudis, who treat women like slaves, like property.
Yeah, it's really obscene, isn't it?
Well, and it shows that this has nothing to do with democracy or freedom or increasing the power of minorities, and has everything to do with lying to the American people about a plan to destroy nation states so that a collapsing empire can reorganize itself and come back stronger than ever. And our job has to be to point out where that empire is. And in the United States, it's Wall Street, it's Obama, it's the leadership of the Republican Party and Boehner. It's the leadership of the Democratic Party around Harry Reid and Pelosi. These are people who don't give a damn about the American people. Both parties. They care about Wall Street.
Exactly.
And we're seeing the people rebel in, for example, the rejection of Eric Cantor. Because Cantor was a Wall Street Republican who sounded conservative, sounded Tea Party, but the way he acted was to protect Wall Street and the right-wing government of Israel. And people voted him out. And what I'm doing with the LaRouche PAC, is we're taking the next 4 weeks. Congress is on recess till the middle of next week, and then they're in session for 3.5 weeks before they basically break for the midterm elections. We've got 3.5 weeks to pound the hell out of this Congress, to go back to Washington and impeach Obama. Because if Obama's thrown out, then you create the room to have a debate on what should we really do with our economic policy. What should we do? How do we get back to a partnership or cooperation with Russia? And how do we get, as you mentioned at the beginning of the program, a new Bretton Woods, which, as the Chinese just said last week, why should some nations be poor?
Right.
We have enough wealth in the world that we can develop nations. You want to deal with immigration problems, disease, help nations develop themselves.
Exactly.
We never did that after World War II because we maintained the power of the British Commonwealth, which is really the British Empire. That's got to change.
In fact, I heard a statement that the in Afghanistan when we put our U.S. Army Corps engineers to actually stop the dry land farming, which promoted the growth of poppy seeds, poppy plants. We have effectively changed them back to where they could actually feed themselves, the Afghanistanis. But that policy was replaced by the Anglo-British attitude, which is, no, keep them poppy seeds growing. Don't let them grow their own food. Same way as the Egyptians, they were forced by the European community that they couldn't be subsistent. They couldn't be completely support themselves in terms of food production, which they could create enough wheat and everything else. They were told by the Europeans, no, you must make certain crops, so you're dependent on bringing crops from elsewhere, like wheat, etc. For you to have agreements with us in Europe.
That's a standard IMF policy for destroying nations. And since we just have a minute left, I just want to, again, we got a lot of calls last week from your listeners. We're doing this mobilization congressional district by congressional district. We have a list by tonight. We'll have 100 congressional districts where there are people who are ready to rebel against Obama. We've got to get people targeting their congressmen. And if people want to be part of this mobilization to impeach, this is, as we've been saying for weeks now, impeachment Central. Call our office and find out what you can do. It's 800-922-2907. We want to put together your listeners with Tea Party people, with progressive Democrats, basically with patriots, especially with July 4th coming up, to win back the American system, win back our Constitution, and get rid of the president who's trying to get rid of it. So call us, become part of this mobilization, 800-922-2907. It's the best thing you can do to celebrate July 4th.
Exactly. This is true Independence Day. How's that?
Yeah. So 800-922-2907.
Amazing. True Independence Day is coming, and that's when you contact the LaRouche Foundation, make your vote known, get into strategies, make sure that we take care of this now. As I say, removing the stumbling stone of America, that's Obama and his administration. Thank you, Harley. Have a happy 4th. Have an amazing 4th. And, of course, leading the way to the truth, the LaRouche Foundation and the Nutrimedical Report. We have coming up Hour 2, our Health and Wellness Hour, Hour 3, Mike Velarde, tax IRS expert. Lots of issues to discuss. Coming up on the 4th with the enforcement of the Unaffordable Health Care Act, the Obamacare back.